There is a reason why some people appear almost too polished, too perfect, too composed in the presence of others. They wear a mask of confidence, charm, power, even benevolence. But behind that carefully constructed facade lies what psychology has long recognized: the shadow. The shadow is not the darkness of the world outside of us, but the hidden, repressed, and often denied aspects of ourselves we cannot bear to face. And for some individuals, especially those who thrive on manipulation and control, this mask is not just a tool of survival. It becomes their entire identity. The mask is seductive. It is crafted to impress, to inspire trust, to disarm suspicion. When you meet someone wearing it, you may feel as if you've encountered someone extraordinary, a leader, a savior, or even a soulmate. But what you are really seeing is a projection, a theater of personality designed to cover what lies beneath. And beneath is not strength, but fragility, not confidence, but fear, not superiority, but deep inferiority. The mask protects the individual from ever confronting this shadow, because the shadow is everything they do not want to admit they are. Think about it: the person who boasts constantly about their success may be running from a shadow of inadequacy. The person who exerts strict control over others may be hiding from the shadow of chaos within. The one who manipulates with charm may be concealing a shadow of emptiness and lack of true intimacy. In every mask lies the opposite truth buried in the shadow, and the more dazzling the mask, the darker the shadow it hides. But here's the paradox: the shadow is not evil in itself. It is simply unacknowledged. It is the part of the psyche that never had permission to come into the light. For most of us, acknowledging our shadow is uncomfortable but necessary. It forces us to confront our weaknesses, our fears, our selfishness, and our wounds. When we accept these aspects, we grow. But for those who refuse, the mask becomes armor. They cling to the mask so tightly that the shadow grows larger, heavier, and more dangerous. This is why dealing with narcissists or manipulators feels so confusing. You are not interacting with a whole person. You are interacting with a mask. And masks are slippery. Masks will say whatever they need to in order to remain intact. You think you're arguing with reason, but you're not. You're arguing with a performance designed to keep the shadow hidden. That's why logic fails, why accountability never sticks, why apologies ring hollow. The mask exists to deflect, to distract, to deny the existence of the shadow altogether. But here is where the true danger lies. The shadow cannot be destroyed by denial. It only grows stronger. When ignored, it leaks out in destructive ways, in cruelty disguised as honesty, in envy disguised as concern, in control disguised as love. The mask may keep up appearances, but the shadow seeps through in behaviors that betray the truth. The charming boss becomes a tyrant in private. The affectionate partner becomes dismissive when the spotlight fades. The generous friend keeps an unspoken tally of every favor. These contradictions are signs of the shadow pressing against the mask. For the person on the receiving end, this creates dissonance. You see the mask and believe it, but you feel the shadow and doubt yourself. That is the hallmark of manipulation. You begin to distrust your own perception. You ask, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I'm the problem. This confusion is not accidental. It is the very effect of the mask. The mask seduces your mind while the shadow unsettles your gut. And when mind and gut are in conflict, most people side with the mask because it is easier to believe the performance than to confront the possibility that something much darker is at play. Yet there is a liberating power in recognizing the mask for what it is. Once you learn to see beyond charm, beyond theatrics, beyond the carefully rehearsed persona, you begin to notice the cracks. The exaggerated smiles that don't reach the eyes, the kindness that vanishes when no one is watching, the sudden rage when their authority is challenged. These cracks are glimpses of the shadow demanding to be seen, and when you notice them, you can no longer be deceived by the mask in the same way. But it takes courage to look at the shadow, not only in others, but in ourselves. Because the truth is, every human being has a shadow. Every mask we wear, whether to impress, to protect, or to hide, conceals some part of us we are unwilling to face. The danger with narcissists and manipulators is not that they have a shadow, it is that they refuse to confront it. They let the mask become their truth, while their shadow grows wild and uncontrolled, spilling into every relationship and poisoning every connection. The mask and the shadow are inseparable. Where there is one, the other exists. To see only the mask is to be fooled. To see only the shadow is to miss the humanity buried beneath. The challenge, then, is not just to recognize the mask, but to understand the shadow it hides, because until you do, you will always be vulnerable to the performance, always trapped in the illusion, always doubting yourself in the face of manipulation. The liberation comes when you pierce the mask with awareness, when you refuse to be blinded by charm or swayed by theatrics. It comes when you trust the discomfort in your gut more than the perfection of the mask. It comes when you realize that the mask is not the truth. The shadow is where the truth lies, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be named, waiting to be seen. There is a curious mechanism in human psychology that often goes unnoticed until it has already done its damage. It is the phenomenon of projection. Projection is when a person cannot tolerate some aspect of themselves. Their insecurity, their fear, their anger, their selfishness. And instead of facing it, they unconsciously assign it to someone else. What they cannot bear to see in their own reflection, they make you carry for them. And for those who thrive on control, especially narcissists and manipulators, projection becomes not just a defense mechanism, but a weapon. It is through projection that they maintain power. Imagine someone who feels deeply inadequate. To face that inadequacy would shatter their carefully built image of superiority, so they bury it. But the buried feeling does not disappear. It searches for an outlet. And so they accuse you of being the inadequate one. Suddenly, you are the problem, you are the weak one, you are the failure. In this way, projection shifts the unbearable weight of their inner world onto your shoulders. Now you are defending yourself, proving your worth, questioning your motives, while they sit comfortably with the illusion that the flaws belong to you. This is why arguments with narcissistic personalities feel so disorienting. You enter the conflict to address a behavior you noticed, but quickly the roles are reversed. You say they are dismissive. They tell you that you are too sensitive. You say they lied. They say you are paranoid. You say they are controlling. They say you are ungrateful. In the end, you are left spinning in circles, not knowing whether you should stand your ground or apologize. This is projection at work. It keeps you occupied with defending yourself while protecting them from ever having to confront their own flaws. Projection is powerful because it exploits your sense of fairness. Most people want to be honest with themselves. If someone accuses you of being selfish, you stop and think, am I being selfish? If they say you are too emotional, you ask yourself, could that be true? This natural introspection is twisted into a tool of manipulation. While you are busy doubting yourself, the projector has successfully diverted attention away from their own behavior. What should have been a moment of accountability for them becomes a moment of confusion for you. It is important to understand that projection often reveals more about the accuser than about the accused. When someone constantly accuses others of being dishonest, it is often because dishonesty is alive within them. When they label others as disloyal, it may be their own disloyalty they cannot face. When they condemn others as selfish, it may be their own selfishness speaking. The accusations are mirrors turned outward, reflections they cannot bear to look at directly. Recognizing this truth begins to break the spell. But projection is not only destructive on the individual level, it operates in relationships, in families, even in entire societies. Parents project their unresolved failures onto their children, demanding they live out the dreams they could not achieve. Leaders project their aggression onto outsiders, painting enemies to justify their own inner turmoil. Communities project their fears onto minorities, scapegoating those who are different. On every level, the projection allows people to avoid their inner work by forcing others to carry the burden of their shadow. For those caught in the web of a manipulator's projection, the greatest danger is internalization. When you begin to absorb their accusations as truth, you start living under the weight of a false identity. You shrink. You apologize too often. You distrust your own perception. The projector now has power over you, not because they are right, but because you believe they might be. The tragedy of projection is not only in the lie itself, but in how often the lie is believed by the one it is cast upon. Escaping this trap requires a shift of awareness. Instead of reflexively accepting every accusation, you pause and ask, is this about me, or is this about them? This question cuts through the fog. If the criticism aligns with your own honest self-reflection, then perhaps it is worth considering. But if the accusation feels strangely misplaced, exaggerated, or manipulative, you are likely witnessing projection. By seeing projection as a mirror of the other's inner world rather than a verdict on your worth, you reclaim your clarity. It takes courage to hold this clarity because projectors do not easily let go of their illusions. The moment you refuse to accept their projections, they often escalate, accusing you even more, trying to draw you back into the dance of self-doubt. But the more you strengthen your inner ground, the less grip their words will have. What once felt like a personal attack begins to look like a confession in disguise. When they call you weak, you see their own weakness. When they call you untrustworthy, you see their own dishonesty. The mask begins to slip, and you are no longer tricked by the performance. Projection is both a shield and a sword. It shields the narcissist from their own self-awareness, and it stabs at others to keep them off balance. But it cannot withstand the light of consciousness. When you see it for what it is, its power collapses. You stop carrying what is not yours. You stop questioning truths you already know. You stop defending yourself against shadows that were never yours to begin with. The projector may continue to hurl their accusations, but they fall flat when they no longer find a home inside you. The real mastery lies not only in recognizing projection in others, but also in yourself. For we all, at times, push away what we dislike within ourselves by finding it in someone else. The difference is whether we take responsibility for it when we notice it. Owning your own shadow prevents it from being weaponized against others. Refusing to own it creates the very manipulations that destroy trust and connection. The choice is always between the temporary comfort of denial and the lasting strength of self-awareness. Every human being desires to be seen, to be valued, to be recognized as significant in the eyes of others. Yet some people cannot accept themselves as they truly are, with flaws, limitations, and vulnerabilities. Instead, they construct an identity made of appearances, a version of themselves built for approval rather than authenticity. This is the false identity, and though it may appear strong, it is more fragile than glass. The fragility of false identity lies not in its ability to convince others, but in the fact that it depends entirely on external validation for survival. A false identity is like a costume worn so long that the wearer forgets what lies beneath. It may look confident, ambitious, generous, or charming, but behind the mask of performance is a deep fear of being exposed. To admit imperfection would shatter the illusion. To acknowledge the shadow would destroy the image. And so every word, every gesture, every relationship becomes a stage where the performance must be maintained at all costs. But living as a performance is exhausting. The person behind the mask must constantly calculate. What should I say to appear strong? How do I respond to appear kind? What story should I tell to appear accomplished? Life becomes less about truth and more about presentation. This endless calculation is fragile because it leaves no room for spontaneity, no room for real emotion, no room for the messiness that makes us human. Any slip of authenticity feels like disaster because it threatens to reveal that the emperor has no clothes. For narcissists and manipulators, the false identity is not just a mask, but a fortress. It is the very structure of their existence. They demand admiration, obedience, and attention, not because they are truly strong, but because without constant reinforcement, the fragile identity begins to crack. Their sense of self is like a balloon, impressive when inflated, but easily punctured by the smallest pin of criticism or indifference. That is why they react so violently when challenged, why they rage at even gentle boundaries, why they collapse into victimhood when admiration is withdrawn. The fragility of their false identity cannot tolerate anything less than worship. The tragedy of this fragility is that it prevents true intimacy. To be truly known by another person requires honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to reveal imperfections. But for someone who lives behind a false identity, intimacy feels like danger. If someone sees too closely, they might discover the cracks, the fears, the insecurities that the mask was designed to hide. And so relationships become hollow, connections built on performance, love built on illusion, loyalty maintained by fear rather than truth. The more a person invests in the false identity, the more they lose touch with who they actually are. Yet the false identity, for all its fragility, has a certain seductive power. On the surface, it can look dazzling. The charm feels magnetic, the confidence persuasive, the story is impressive. Many people are drawn into its glow, mistaking the performance for reality. But over time, the cracks begin to show. The kindness disappears when no one is watching. The confidence turns brittle when confronted with real challenge. The generosity transforms into resentment when it is not rewarded. These contradictions are signals that the false identity is struggling to hold itself together. And here lies the paradox. The more fragile the false identity becomes, the more fiercely it must be defended. Instead of admitting the truth, the person doubles down on the illusion. They project their flaws onto others, manipulate perceptions, rewrite stories, anything to preserve the mask. The fragility creates desperation, and desperation breeds control. Those around them begin to feel trapped in the performance, forced to applaud, forced to agree, forced to play along, or else face the wrath of someone whose entire self-image depends on their compliance. But no mask lasts forever. Life has a way of testing every identity. Challenges come that cannot be glossed over with charm. Failures arrive that no story can rewrite. Relationships demand authenticity that performance cannot provide. And when these moments appear, the fragility of false identity is revealed. Sometimes it shatters dramatically in public scandals or broken relationships. Other times it erodes quietly, leaving the person hollow and isolated, unable to understand why they feel so empty despite all their efforts to appear full. For those who encounter individuals living through false identity, the lesson is clarity. Do not be blinded by the mask. Do not confuse performance for truth. Recognize that the louder the performance, the deeper the fear it conceals. When someone demands endless validation, it is not strength you are witnessing, but fragility. When someone cannot handle even the smallest criticism, it is not confidence you are seeing, but insecurity disguised as power. The fragility of false identity is always revealed in its intolerance of reality. The deeper truth is that all of us have, at times, worn a false identity. We have presented ourselves as stronger than we felt, kinder than we were, more confident than we believed. This is part of being human. But the difference lies in whether we eventually return to authenticity. To cling to the mask permanently is to live in fear, forever fragile, forever dependent on the applause of others. To set the mask down and accept the shadow is to discover strength that does not shatter when tested. The fragile identity collapses under truth. The authentic self grows because of it. The fragility of false identity will always reveal itself in the end, because no performance can replace reality and no illusion can outlast the weight of truth. There is a quiet power in the word no. It does not scream, it does not fight, it does not need to justify itself endlessly. Yet it carries with it a force that can dismantle manipulation, protect dignity, and restore balance to relationships. Boundaries, at their essence, are not walls built to keep people out, but thresholds that honor where one person ends and another begins. And it is in the recognition of this threshold that liberation is found. Many people fear boundaries because they confuse them with rejection. They believe saying no means being cruel, selfish, or unloving. But boundaries are not about punishment. They are about truth. They are declarations of what is acceptable and what is not, of how much you can give without breaking, of where your freedom meets the freedom of another. When spoken with clarity, boundaries are acts of respect for yourself and for the other person. Without them, relationships collapse under the weight of resentment, manipulation, or silent suffering. Consider how a manipulator thrives. Their power exists in the absence of boundaries. They test, they push, they cross lines in subtle ways until suddenly you are doing things you never wanted, agreeing to conditions that feel unfair, or sacrificing your own peace just to avoid conflict. In this fog, you lose yourself piece by piece. But the moment you set a boundary, the fog begins to lift. You reclaim what is yours, your time, your energy, your dignity. That reclamation is nothing less than liberation. A boundary is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as saying, "I'm not available right now." Sometimes it is stating, "I will not discuss this further if the conversation turns disrespectful." Other times it is walking away entirely from a dynamic that has consumed too much of your spirit. Each act of boundary setting, whether small or large, affirms the same truth. You are not here to be controlled, diminished, or used as an extension of someone else's will. You exist as a whole being with needs, values, and limits that matter. For those who have lived without boundaries, the first step toward them can feel terrifying. You may expect anger, withdrawal, guilt-tripping, or accusations of selfishness, and often that expectation is accurate. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will resist when you finally draw them. They may rage, they may play the victim, they may attempt to convince you that you are cruel for choosing yourself. But this resistance is not proof that you are wrong. It is proof that the boundary is working. It exposes the dynamic that had been hidden in silence. The liberation of boundaries is not only about keeping harmful people at bay, it is also about creating space for authentic connection. When boundaries are present, relationships can thrive on honesty rather than obligation. Two people who respect each other's limits are free to meet as equals. There is no hidden resentment, no silent keeping of score, no exploitation disguised as love. Boundaries transform relationships from arenas of control into spaces of respect. What many forget is that boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the foundation of it. Love without boundaries becomes enmeshment, where one person disappears into the other. Care without boundaries becomes exploitation, where giving is drained of joy and turned into obligation. Even freedom without boundaries becomes chaos, where no one knows where the lines of respect begin or end. Boundaries are the architecture that allow love, care, and freedom to exist without destroying the people who give and receive them. There is also a spiritual dimension to boundaries. To honor your limits is to acknowledge that your life has value. It is to say, my energy is sacred, my time is finite, my soul deserves peace. Without this acknowledgement, you become vulnerable to every demand, every manipulation, every pull from the outside world that insists you should give more than you can sustain. With it, you begin to live with intention rather than reaction, with clarity rather than confusion. You discover that protecting your inner world is not selfish, it is necessary. The liberation that comes from boundaries also reshapes how you see yourself. No longer defined by how much you can endure, you begin to define yourself by how clearly you can choose. Instead of asking, what do they want from me? You begin to ask, what do I want for myself? That shift of focus reclaims your identity from the hands of others. You are no longer a puppet pulled by strings of guilt or fear. You are a person standing on your own ground, able to decide where you will walk and where you will not. Boundaries do not guarantee comfort. In fact, they often invite discomfort because they disrupt the patterns others have come to rely on. But comfort built on compliance is a prison. Discomfort built on boundaries is freedom. The former keeps you quiet, the latter makes you whole. The temporary storm that comes from asserting a boundary is nothing compared to the lifelong storm of living without them. And so the liberation of boundaries is not merely about protection, but about creation. By saying no to what violates you, you say yes to what sustains you. By refusing to carry what is not yours, you free your hands to build what is. Boundaries carve out the space in which your true self can breathe, speak, and grow without suffocation. They do not shut life out, they make life livable. To be authentic is to stand bare before the world, not stripped of clothing, but of pretense. It is to reveal yourself without disguise, without the constant calculation of how others will judge you, without the masks of charm, perfection, or false strength. Authenticity is not about being flawless, but about being real. Yet for many people, and especially for those who live through manipulation or narcissistic identity, authenticity is terrifying. It represents not freedom, but danger. It is the very thing they fear most because it threatens to unravel the carefully constructed illusions that keep them safe. Why is authenticity so frightening? Because authenticity leaves no room to hide. When you speak with honesty instead of strategy, you expose yourself to rejection. When you live according to your true values instead of bending to others, you risk abandonment. When you stop performing for approval, you confront the possibility of being unloved for who you really are. For those who build their sense of worth on external validation, this risk is unbearable. They fear that if the mask is removed, nothing of value will remain underneath. This fear is particularly sharp in those who construct false identities. Their entire self-image is a performance dependent on how others see them. To be authentic would mean acknowledging the shadow they have spent their lives avoiding, the insecurity, the pain, the inadequacy, the raw and imperfect humanity that exists beneath the mask. They believe that if this truth were ever seen, it would mean rejection, humiliation, or loss of power. And so authenticity is treated like a threat rather than a path to liberation. But the irony is that what they fear in others is truly what they fear in themselves. They do not want to face their own vulnerability. They do not want to admit that their power is borrowed from performance, that their confidence is fragile, that their superiority is a defense against feeling small. Authenticity would demand they confront these truths, and in that confrontation, the illusion of control would shatter. Thus, they resist it at all costs. For those who encounter such people, the fear of authenticity often appears in subtle ways. You may notice how they dodge direct questions, offering stories that sound polished but never quite real. You may see how they shift the focus when their flaws are mentioned, projecting the problem onto you instead. You may feel how their presence changes depending on the audience, as though they are constantly shifting to maintain approval. Each of these behaviors is a strategy to avoid authenticity, because authenticity would mean being consistent, being vulnerable, being the same person no matter who is watching. What is most revealing, however, is how they react when someone else chooses authenticity in their presence. Speak your truth calmly and watch how discomfort creeps into their response. Refuse to apologize for who you are and notice the irritation it stirs. Set a boundary with clarity and see how it is met with resistance, anger, or withdrawal. Your authenticity exposes their performance. It reminds them of what they are not willing to be. That is why authentic people are often resented, attacked, or dismissed by those who fear authenticity, not because authenticity is wrong, but because it threatens the illusion they live within. And yet, authenticity is not only threatening to manipulators, it is also frightening to ordinary people. To be authentic is to risk criticism, to risk misunderstanding, to risk the vulnerability of being seen too clearly. It requires courage because it strips away the comfort of blending in and forces you to stand as yourself without camouflage. Many avoid it not because they want to deceive others, but because they fear they cannot withstand the consequences of being real. But here lies the paradox. Authenticity, though feared, is also the only path to real freedom. When you stop performing for approval, the chains of external validation begin to fall away. When you stop hiding your imperfections, shame loses its grip. When you stop shaping yourself to meet others' expectations, you finally discover what it means to live from your own center. The fear of authenticity is real, but the liberation on the other side is even more powerful. The fear of authenticity is, at its core, a fear of exposure. But what if exposure is not the end, but the beginning? What if the parts of ourselves we hide most desperately are not our greatest liabilities, but our greatest teachers? To confront our fears, our insecurities, our wounds, is to reclaim them as part of who we are. And once reclaimed, they can no longer be used against us. Authenticity transforms weakness into wholeness because it integrates what was once divided. For those who manipulate, authenticity is unbearable because it makes control impossible. You cannot control someone who refuses to play the game of appearances. You cannot gaslight someone who trusts their own perception. You cannot dominate someone who speaks truth without fear. This is why manipulators and narcissists resist authenticity in themselves and fear it in others. It strips away their power, not through violence, but through clarity. To live authentically is to risk rejection, but it is also to invite real connection. For when you reveal your true self, you create space for others to do the same. The bonds formed in authenticity may be fewer, but they are stronger because they are not built on illusion. They are built on truth. And truth, unlike performance, does not collapse under pressure. The fear of authenticity will always whisper warnings that you will be judged, abandoned, unloved. But those warnings are the echoes of a world that thrives on illusion. In reality, authenticity is the only ground strong enough to stand on, the only foundation that cannot be stolen, the only self that cannot be destroyed when the applause fades.